Good morning and thank you for attending the Pennsylvania Fisheries Summit. As an introduction, my name is Mike Porta. I am the Area 6 Fisheries Manager in Southeast Pennsylvania, and today I will be discussing some of Pennsylvania's panfish fisheries. Panfish populations create some of the most popular sport fisheries in the United States. This is because they have widespread distributions. Many of these species are found in aquatic systems throughout the country and are therefore accessible to a large number of anglers. In general, some of these species are also fairly easy to catch, particularly some of the sunfish species. And because they can be easy to catch, they are great for introducing children to the sport of fishing. And finally, panfish are very desirable to eat, so many anglers enjoy harvesting fish for their very high food quality. In Pennsylvania, panfish represent the second most preferred species group, following only trout. And in today's presentation, I'll be discussing some of the more important panfish species to Pennsylvania anglers and those that are probably most commonly found and most abundant in the state. Those species being bluegills, crappies, both black and white crappies, rock bass, and yellow perch. Of the panfish species I'm going to cover today, bluegills are the most widely distributed and most common. Looking at the range map to the right, particularly the yellow portion of the range map, you can see that the native range of the bluegill was in the Great Lakes and Mississippi River basins, as well as the Gulf and Atlantic slope in the southern portion of the U.S., which means that the native range of bluegills in Pennsylvania would have been the western one-third of the state. However, at this point, due to introductions across the state, bluegills are widely distributed in Pennsylvania and found in most aquatic systems throughout the state. I've included below a bar graph just as a comparison of where the Pennsylvania state record bluegill falls in comparison to other state records in the U.S. And the Pennsylvania bluegill record weighs in at 2 pounds 9 ounces, and it was caught at Keystone Lake in Armstrong County. And while it does fall within the lower one-third of all state record fish caught in the U.S., it is particularly impressive that this was a fish caught from a public water body. Black and white crappies are native to the Great Lakes and Mississippi basins. And like the bluegill, the black crappie is also native to the Gulf and Atlantic slopes of the southern U.S. Both species also have been widely distributed outside of their native ranges as a result of introductions for creation of sport fishing opportunities. And at this point, these species are found throughout Pennsylvania, even though they would have their native range would have been confined to the western one-third of the state. In general, black crappies can be found in lakes that have clear water and are vegetated, whereas it seems white crappies do better in environments that are more turbid or muddy in nature. And looking at the bar graph below for comparison of the state records from across the U.S., you can see that Pennsylvania's state record crappie falls in the upper one half of state records. These here are being compared amongst state record white crappies. The Pennsylvania state record crappie was 4 pounds 3 ounces from Hammond Lake in Tioga County, and with a few exceptions, the majority of state records larger than that of Pennsylvania's came from southern states where the growing season is considerably longer than that in Pennsylvania. Rock bass are native to the Mississippi River and Great Lakes basins, and much like bluegills and crappies, this would mean that they were confined in a native range to the western one-third of the state of Pennsylvania. However, much like these other species, they have also been introduced outside of this native range and are now found in many parts of Pennsylvania, particularly in reservoirs with rocky shoreline habitat or in warm water streams and rivers. Rock bass have similar life histories to that of smallmouth bass and can be found in similar habitats. Looking at the bar graph below, you can see that the Pennsylvania state record rock bass falls second only to the state of Michigan's state record, and the state record rock bass in Pennsylvania weighed in at 3 pounds, 2 ounces, and was captured in Elk Creek in Erie County. The yellow perch is native to the upper Mississippi and Great Lakes basins, as well as the Atlantic slope south to about South Carolina. This means that the state of Pennsylvania falls almost entirely within the native range of the yellow perch, which is different than the previous species that were discussed in this presentation. Looking at the bar graph below, you can see that the Pennsylvania state record falls within the top 10 state records across the U.S. This particular specimen weighed 2 pounds, 14 ounces, and was caught in Presque Isle Bay, Erie County. Because of the importance of panfishes in Pennsylvania, staff from the Fish and Boat Commission routinely monitor these populations. Panfish evaluations are conducted during spring using Pennsylvania-style trap nets. The trap nets, once set, are allowed to sit for 24 hours, at which time biologists will return to the net to process any captured fish. All fish captured in the net are identified to species and counted. The fish are measured for total length, and scale samples are taken from a subset of the fish for age estimation purposes. Looking at the photograph in the upper right-hand corner, it's just an example of a trap net set. And then the lower left-hand corner is biologists returning to the net and lifting a trap net. And then, of course, the last photo just shows some of the target species for these surveys. Following completion of the field season, data that were captured during surveys conducted earlier in the year are entered and analyzed. At that time, biologists are also preparing scales for age estimation, and an age estimate is assigned to each fish from which a scale sample was collected. The photograph of the scale below is intended to give an example of what biologists are looking at when they're conducting age estimation of fish using a scale sample. And in this particular case, this fish was aged at 4 years of age. Because biologists also captured the lengths of fish while in the field, we can also calculate mean length at age, which can be used for evaluating growth rates of fish. And we can also use those lengths to evaluate the size structure of fish in these populations. The growth curves and length frequency distribution, like shown to the right, provide biologists with important information for managing these populations. For example, in the upper graph comparing the growth curves of bluegill and pumpkin seed, you can see that bluegills attain a slightly larger size on average than do pumpkin seeds. In the example below, looking at the length frequency distribution of bluegill, this particular example provides biologists with information that suggests that more than 77% of the population of over 500 fish that were captured during that particular survey exceeded 7 inches, suggesting that there's a lot of fish of quality size in this particular population. Panfish management in Pennsylvania relies almost entirely on natural reproduction to maintain these populations. However, some panfish species have complex life history strategies that present management challenges. For example, bluegills are aggregate spawners where male bluegills invest substantial energy in the building and defending of nests. However, there are small males that mimic females or sneaker males that enter the congregation of nests to spawn with females, but never participate in the building or defense of nests. This can result in passing traits on to their offspring to invest little energy in growth, but to mature rapidly, resulting in stunted individuals. Further, bluegills also spawn several times a year and can become highly abundant. So under these scenarios, this can result in an overabundant, stunted bluegill population. Crappies, rock bass, and yellow perch also can experience highly variable recruitment. And because of the variation in recruitment, these boom or bust year classes can result in populations maintained by a few very abundant year classes. Because for the most part, panfish populations are highly abundant, the historical management perspective was that panfish populations, and in particular sunfish populations, could not be overharvested. Under high abundance scenarios, Panfish-specific regulations may often be liberal, having a high or aggregate bag limit. And under certain scenarios, some states might even manage panfish species with no bag limits, length limits, or seasons in an attempt to promote high harvest rates. Liberal regulations are most effective for overabundant stunted panfish populations, where the overarching goal is to increase harvest rates, which increases the mortality rates of that fish population, and a reduction in number of fish in the population reduces competition between members of the same species or among various species in a fish community, which in turn hopefully equates to increases in individual growth rates within the population because there's more forage resources available. A fairly liberal regulation that Pennsylvania applies to this scenario, which is a high abundance scenario, are the Commonwealth Inland Regulations, where it is an open year-round season with no minimum length limit and a 50 fish combined species bag limit. There are panfish populations that benefit from more restrictive harvest regulations. And under these scenarios, growth rates may be good, but large fish are currently being overharvested. The overharvest of large fish occurs seasonally, and this particularly happens when fish are congregated while spawning in the spring or in winters with extended ice cover, both of which are scenarios that allow for increased harvest pressure. The overharvest of large fish could result in undesirable size structure of fish in a population, or may even alter the life history strategy of a particular species. In the case of bluegills, the presence of large male fish are important for persistence of large fish in the population because these fish may pass on traits to their offspring that promotes investment of energy into rapid growth rates. Under these conditions where large fish are being overharvested, the implementation of a length and or bag limit may result in a reduction of fishing mortality of the large fish. Pennsylvania's Panfish Enhancement Regulation is a good example of a more restricted harvest regulation that is applied to populations experiencing overharvest of large fish. The intended goal of this particular regulation program is to increase the number, quality, and size of panfish in a particular population by reducing fishing mortality of larger fish. Here I present statewide average ages at a particular fish's length for the various panfish species, and I present them to show why the overharvest of large fish from a population can be detrimental. Very simply, it just takes a long period of time to reach large sizes, and the largest fish in these populations are often most important to ensure persistence of large fish in future populations. As you can see from some of the tables, fish growth is rapid early on in life, but as that fish gets older, growth slows through time. For example, a 9-inch bluegill is approximately 8 years old on average. A 14-inch crappie takes between 9 and 14 plus years to achieve 14 inches, depending on the species, whether it's a black or white crappie. And growth rates of yellow perch are even slower. To produce a 13-inch yellow perch, that fish is approaching 14 years of age on average. So the point is, it takes a long period of time to produce a large fish and a long period of time to replenish large fish when they're being overharvested from a population. There are additional management strategies that Fish and Boat Commission staff may use for managing panfish populations in Pennsylvania. Some examples of these are potentially more restrictive harvest regulations on certain panfish populations. A few examples of where more restrictive regulations are applied are on the F.J. Sayers crappie population, where the bag limit of crappies is 10 fish per day. And of those 10 fish, only 5 can be over 9 inches in length. Additionally, there's a 10 fish bag limit on rock bass in the Juniata River system. An additional strategy that we may use is stocking of reservoirs with panfish. However, this typically occurs following the renovation of a reservoir to implement a particular species back into, or reintroduce a species back into that reservoir post reclamation in order to reestablish those populations. Water level manipulation in a reservoir can sometimes be used to manage panfish populations. This scenario can be applied particularly when you have stunted fish populations where very thick and abundant vegetation may be present. So the water levels may be drawn down to force small fish that are hiding in the vegetation out into the open lake and make them more accessible to predators that are living out in the open water part of the lake. In theory, this would reduce the number of small fish in the population, which would potentially improve their individual growth rates, because they would have more forage resources available to them because their population has been thinned. And additionally, habitat management can be implemented into some of these reservoirs. Our lake habitat section of the Division of Habitat Management implements various habitat structures in the reservoirs for the intent of producing better panfish populations. Pennsylvania's lakes and reservoirs provide fantastic panfishing opportunities, and these opportunities can be found by anglers during all times of the year. And typically, panfish can be found in shallow water for the majority of the year. This makes panfish very accessible to anglers. However, there are times a year where fish may move into deeper waters during late fall or winter. Anglers targeting panfish will find most of the fish congregated near in-lake structures, such as on contour changes or breaks, near vegetation beds or on vegetation lines, or near woody structures such as felled trees or standing timber. And these habitats should be concentrated on by anglers, whether fishing during the open water time of year or when there's ice cover that allows ice fishing opportunities. Pan fishing tactics can be quite simple by simply fishing live minnows and or worms or soft plastics underneath of a bobber. Blade baits, spoons, and small jigs can be used successfully by panfish anglers. And during certain times of year, crickets or grasshopper patterns that mimic natural baits can be very effective. Probably the most important tip I could give panfish anglers, though, would be to have a willingness to move. Because panfish have very patchy distributions, they're not found in all areas of the lake. So anglers that are more mobile will be able to find the schools or congregations of fish. Warm water streams and rivers also create fantastic panfishing opportunities in Pennsylvania, particularly for species such as rock bass and red-breast sunfish. These systems provide great summertime angling opportunities where anglers can take advantage of wet wading or floating down a river on a canoe or kayak to access habitats on the rivers or streams. Some habitats that anglers should concentrate on to have the best fishing success in these systems would be log jams or woody debris, or large boulders that create eddies or slow-moving water scenarios that concentrate some of these fish species. Key baits in warm water streams and rivers would be small plastic grubs fished on a jig head, or simply by fishing a night crawler underneath of a bobber, or by mimicking some of the more common aquatic invertebrates in these systems, such as hellgrammites. Finally, I conclude with a list of the best panfishing waters from across the state of Pennsylvania. Many of these waters are included on our best fishing waters list that is provided on our website. The waters listed here represent those that produce the highest abundances of quality-sized panfish found in the state. This list is not intended to be all-inclusive, and there are lakes or water bodies not included on this list. However, there are many systems across the state that do provide good panfishing opportunities that are not found on this list. The only differences being the size structure, abundances, and species compositions may differ in these populations. Because there's a lot of lakes listed here I will pause here for a moment to give participants the opportunity to take a screenshot of this slide or capture it with a photograph. This concludes my presentation. Again, my name is Mike Porta, and I certainly appreciate your attention and interest in the topic of panfish fisheries in Pennsylvania. You are reminded to submit any questions that you might have for panel discussion at the conclusion of today's presentations.